A negative externality, we'll start with this one first, is one that imposes costs on bystanders. So if you look at the diagram to the left, in private markets, in markets without externalities, the supply curve that reflects private costs depends on the costs and technologies facing the seller, right? We talked about the things that were important in deciding where a supply curve is located, things like technology and input prices and whatnot. But when there are external costs as well, costs to be borne by other people, those are not fully reflected in the private firm's supply curve. So when the firm decides how much to produce, they don't take into account the costs that they're imposing on others, only the ones they face themselves. So a negative externality, for example, pollution or noise or something like that, is a place where the private costs are borne outside of, where there are costs borne in addition to the private costs that are faced by the actual producers. So if we think about the market for gasoline, for instance, when consumers consume gas, they're imposing costs and pollution on the rest of us. We're more likely to have asthma and respiratory problems and the rest of that kind of thing. The pollution costs of gasoline are an external cost. When we include those costs in our measure, we can think about a social supply curve. That's the pink line in the diagram. And the pink line, the social supply curve, measures the total cost that's imposed by the consumption of gasoline on society. Now, when you look at the diagram, you can see the difference between the equilibrium output that the market would produce, that's QE, and the socially optimal output that the market produces, that's Q0. And if you look at the shaded area, those are costs in excess of benefits. The last unit produced by the market, unit number QE, has a social cost that's up to the pink line, but a market price and a marginal benefit to the marginal consumer that's at the market equilibrium price, right? So this difference, the height of that triangle at QE represents this external cost above and beyond the benefit provided to the marginal consumer. And if you think about the ones between Q0 or QO and QE, the optimal quantity and the equilibrium quantity, each of those things is imposing higher costs on society once externalities are fully included. Then they're providing benefits as measured by the demand curve. So the costs to society of those units exceed the benefits to society. Benefits, remember, are given by the demand curve. How much do consumers value these units of output? Now, that cost is just the excess cost due to the externality. If we want to think about the total cost of the externality, then look at the whole shaded parallelogram. If we want to, when we finally get to measure consumer surplus, we need to, when we finally want to measure total surplus, we need to subtract the shaded area off of our original diagram. We need to subtract that shaded area off the original diagram. And so total surplus is much, much smaller than in the presence of an externality than it is in a market without an externality. That shaded area needs to be subtracted away. Note that Q0 is where marginal social cost equals marginal social benefit. The benefit to consumers at that point exceeds the cost to producers by exactly the social cost of production. It might be helpful to see a numerical example. So if we take a look at this diagram, we can see that the market in equilibrium would produce 1,000 gallons of gas at a market clearing price of $4. When we think about the external cost, in this example, in the market for gasoline, if we suppose that each gallon produces 75 cents in pollution costs in addition to whatever the production costs are, we can see that the social supply curve sits 75 cents higher than the private supply curve. When the market is left to function on its own, the marginal driver, the one who consumes the 1,000th gallon of gas, is willing to pay $4, and the marginal producer will sell it for $4. Bystanders suffer, the bystanders suffer 75 cents in harm due to that last gallon being consumed. So the marginal surplus then of the 1,000th gallon is minus 0.75 cents. That last gallon is a net cost to society of 75 cents. Consumers get $4 in benefits, producers assume $4 in costs, and society assumes an additional 75 cents in costs. Now, look what happens if the quantity was reduced to the optimal quantity of 800. In this case, the marginal driver is willing to pay $4.50. The marginal producer could produce for $3.75, and bystanders suffer $0.75 in harm. So the net benefit to society of gallon number 800 is 0. But consider what happens for gallons of gasoline consumed to the left of 800. Those gallons, as measured by the demand curve, produce a net benefit of something higher than $4.50. Those gallons also, as measured by the pink social supply curve, can be produced at a cost of less than $4.50 to society. So those gallons are providing net surplus. And in fact, if the market were to produce exactly 800 gallons of gas, that shaded area would represent the total surplus at the surplus maximizing level of output for gasoline. So you can see in the presence of negative externalities, the market will tend to overproduce gasoline. On the other side of the coin, we might think about positive externalities. Some benefits are conveyed to bystanders. For instance, education is an example of a good with a positive externality. We're all better off when all the people who are around us have some level of education. Consider vaccines as well. This is a popular issue right now. Vaccinating yourself protects you, and it also protects the others you might spread the disease on. So I benefit when you are vaccinated. And you can construct lots more examples of goods that have positive externalities or positive spillover benefits. Now, the way to represent this graphically is to think about benefits that are not represented in the private demand curve. So when you have a good that generates positive externalities, it's generating benefits or social benefits in excess of those that are enjoyed by the consumer of the good, by the actual consumer of the good. And in this case, the market will tend to underproduce goods with positive externalities. The market will produce QM in our graph, but the socially optimal level would be QO in our graph. And by producing at QO, we can increase the amount of total surplus produced by the market.